The Assembly Committee on Government Affairs will come to order. Madam Secretary, if I could have you please call roll.
Assemblywoman Anderson.
Present.
Assemblywoman Black.
Here.
Assemblywoman Brown May.
Here.
Assemblywoman Considine.
Present.
Assemblywoman Dickman.
Here.
Assemblywoman Duran.
Here.
Assemblyman Ellison.
Present.
Assemblywoman Martinez.
Present.
Assemblyman Matthews.
Here.
Assemblyman MacArthur.
Here.
Assemblywoman Thomas.
Here.
Assemblywoman Torres.
Here.
Chair Flores.
Here. Thank you, Madam Secretary. So I think I'd like to start off this morning welcoming our very newest member, Assemblywoman Brown. I just wanted to say how grateful we are to have you on this committee, particularly because, members, as you all can imagine, she found out just a few days ago that she was going to be moving up to Carson City, that she was going to be joining a whole host of committees, that she was going to be taking on some of the very heavy conversations of a pandemic. And she did all that while deciding maybe just a few days before that she was going to be taking on that responsibility. And so I just wanted to say we are grateful to have you on our team. I know you bring a wealth of experience to this building. You are not someone new to it. You've had an opportunity to work outside of it, inside of it, and I think you know how to navigate these waters quite well. But I think nobody can explain who you are, your resume better than yourself. So I'd love to give you an opportunity, Assemblywoman Brown, if you could please just give us a quick intro of yourself, let the team know what you're bringing to the table. And team, I think you're all going to be very happy to know she's with us. Assemblywoman Brown, please.
Thank you, Chair Flores. I appreciate the opportunity to provide a brief introduction. I'm thrilled to be a part of this committee. I know that government affairs is integral to the success of our state and how we operate. I've spent the last 20 years in the nonprofit sector in Southern Nevada and have worked to build great partnerships both across the country and across our state. Specifically focused really on how do we access marginalized populations into our policies and how do we make sure that every voice is heard. Prior to that, I spent about 6 years in gaming. So really got an understanding of how did gaming operate, what did it take to run a major property, as well as the corporation across the country. I've been involved in many boards and chairs and commissions and volunteer opportunities throughout the last 20 years or so. And I've had an opportunity to come up here and advocate on behalf of people with developmental disabilities on multiple occasions. Many of you, longtime legislators, have met many of those folks as they are your constituents. So I'm honored and thrilled to be a part of this committee. And I look forward to working alongside all of you. Thanks for having me, Chair.
And again, welcome to the team, Assemblywoman. We look forward to working alongside of you. Members, I want to remind you to please keep your microphone muted at all times. Please keep your cameras on. And unless you're speaking, of course, and at that time, please unmute. For those of you following virtually, I want to remind you that every folk here on this committee has a unique setup. We're always going to be looking in different directions. It doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to the video. It's just some of us have multiple monitors and have a whole host of things happening back here. I also want to remind you that today we're going to be having our very first bill. And I think all of you are very excited. I know none of you slept because you stayed up all night working incredibly hard, dissecting every comma. And I think I see Assemblyman Matthews. He's going to tell us why we got some of those semicolons in there. But I do appreciate everybody's attentiveness. I got a bunch of messages last night via text, and it just shows that everybody was paying attention and ready for this morning. So I appreciate you. We're going to take the agenda in the order it appears. And so we're going to have two presentations followed by the bill itself. I want to remind members that up until we get the presentation from our bill, and we open it up for that hearing, that we refrain from asking any questions related to that bill until we hear the presentation and we go through that. I want to ask members, I know some of us have the tendency of wanting to take over the discussion just because we have so many questions. I want to be fair and give everybody an opportunity to ask a question first, and then we'll come back if we have a lot of follow-ups and stuff like that. I don't anticipate today being too heavy in terms of trying to coordinate with opposition, support, neutral, but it is the intention of this committee that we'll take it in the order of support. We'll have the bill presentation followed by questions from the committee. We'll do support, opposition, and then neutral, and then we'll allow for the bill presenter to do any closing remarks. That's going to be the nature of how we'll move through each bill presentation. And if members, you have any questions, as always, please put them on the chat, let me know, and we'll take care of it. So with that, I want to open it up to our presentation from the Department of Administration, Office of Grant Procurement, Coordination, and Management. Whenever you're ready, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. I'm Erin Hasty. I'm the interim administrator. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Flores and members of the committee for having us today. We're grateful to be here. With me, I have Department Director Laura Freed, who may jump in from time to time. But again, I'm Erin Hasty, the interim administrator. Grateful to be here. I wouldn't have guessed, 7.5 years ago when I did my first grant, like going from, hey, this sounds like a really cool opportunity and way to bring services, to be sitting here right now and looking at all the issues. So I appreciate your time. I am going to try and share my screen. Okay. So, yeah, we are known as the Nevada Grant Office for short. We kind of have a mouthful, Office of Grant Procurement and Coordination, but the Nevada Grant Office is how we're more commonly referred to. Our mission is to increase the number of grant dollars Nevada receives by reducing and removing barriers to federal grant funding by providing grant resources, advocacy, and coordination. And so during this presentation, my intention is to give you like a high-level overview of grants and a look into day-to-day what our office does, and then really to show you kind of pre-COVID and how we've shifted during COVID, as a lot of us have. Essentially, our office has a 30,000-foot overview of grant issues. So there are other grant units within agencies, but our office really seeks to provide resources for grant professionals and grant seekers. As you may know, grants are very, not complicated, but there's a life cycle through them. There's pre-award all the way through post-award. And so each phase has quite a heavy lift. So, even going from applying for a grant, there are numerous issues, barriers, and opportunities in that. And then there are things that you have to do in order to continue to maintain that grant. And so that's what a lot of the state agency grant units work on. We're here to provide any resources that help ease and identify and how to make that easier. High-level overview. So we have the Department Director, Laura Freed, Deputy Director Colleen Murphy within the Department of Admin. I'm serving as the interim administrator. My permanent role is the Senior Executive Grant Analyst, so that is vacant right now. And our Admin Assistant 4 is vacant right now. So we're a small and mighty team of 5 when we're fully staffed, and we're a small and mighty team of 3 right now. We were created in 2011 after a SAGE Commission report thought that a grant coordinator would be good to help with Nevada's flagging grant performance. We're governed by NRS 232, 222 through 227, and historically we've provided a lot of resources on the pre-award side. I would say, like, as the office has matured, kind of like my knowledge of grants as I was going through it, we saw that there are a lot of barriers in grant management. And so our office has shifted, from pre-award, like helping to write applications, to then addressing grant barriers. So you see some of what we do there. It's a little bit of everything. We've provided, grant writing, project management, finding opportunities, and going through grants.gov to show like you're interested in education grants. Okay, like here's some grants that might be useful for you. So we do quite a bit. And again, as we've had conversations with stakeholders, we've revealed more and more what we can do to be helpful. And some of those you'll see a little bit later. In our day-to-day, we provide some strategic grant services. So we track all of the contacts that we have, and they break down into these buckets, essentially. And within those buckets, there are quite a few areas. Like funding opportunities can mean that we have 13 topical listservs, and then we will track any grants that are relevant that are coming up and send out a grant opportunity. Grant assistance, we've done anything from write the whole grant application to project coordinate, and done presentations. So within those areas, there are quite a few services that we provide. So now I'm going to shift like our pre-COVID, and then you'll see a little bit later like how post-COVID has affected us. So pre-COVID, we've got January 19th through about the beginning of March 2020. We were contacted by about 15,000 times for service requests, which is average about 1,000 per month. We also track, are we initiating the contact or are people coming to us and then we're reacting to that? So you'll see 67% of those were initiated by our office, and that can be anything from sending out listservs to contacting people that we know are interested in topics and showing them that there's a grant that's available to them that they might be interested in. We've also been able to track the unique grant opportunities, and you'll see that we do deal with some foundation and like state grants, but the large bulk that we do is from federal agencies, so federal grants. The partners, so when somebody contacts us, we have it broken down into who it is. The bulk of our contacts were from state agencies, but then the second, nonprofits and local agencies. We also track if there's a competitive opportunity or like if it's mandatory formula. I have a slide a little bit later that I can, that breaks it down a little bit. But most of what we deal with is competitive discretionary grants. And then about 20% of the opportunities that we tracked required match funds. And you'll see a little bit later that we had a grant program that dealt with match funds that we've identified to be a barrier to some agencies and organizations applying for grants. Okay, so then we switched to COVID. So this is March to December. We had 4,300 service requests, which dropped our monthly average to 548 requests. During this time, for about 5 months, we were a staff of 2. So that might be why it dropped a little. But again, 56% of us, the contacts were initiated by us. And then the unique opportunities, again, the bulk is federal funding. Our partner requests shifted during COVID. So you saw before it was like still the number one is state agencies, but then we had an uptick in businesses and citizens reaching out to us. I think like a lot of people, like the lack of centralized rollout from the federal government was confusing. And so people were searching for where to get funds, what funds were available. And so we had more from businesses and citizens. Still the bulk were competitive opportunities, about the same amount required match. During the grants during COVID, some of it ended up being more supplemental. So that means like if you had an award before, then you get it awarded. So a little drop there in the competitive. So as we were grappling with COVID and how best to position our agency, we reached out to state agencies and asked, this is at the beginning where we didn't know like what funding opportunities were going to come out. Were they going to be competitive? Were they formula? We were just trying to wrap our arms around it. We reached out to state agencies and had about 524 responses asking what would be most helpful to them as we're identifying any opportunities from COVID-19. So the top answers from completely helpful are there. And then, so that was applying for grants. Then on the other side of it, there's properly managing all federal grants. So, there's application and then there's managing the grant. And so the importance of properly managing a grant is to reduce audit findings so that we don't have to pay money back, so that we can get future funding opportunities. Sometimes some grant streams will award another time. So the proper management is a really critical issue. And it's also can be really hard. And there was a lot of compliance that was coming out, like in addition to the health, there was just like a fire hose of information on funding. So we asked to properly manage federal grants for COVID, what would be the most helpful? So these are answers ranked from completely helpful. So we had, these survey results, and we created some services in response to COVID-19. We shifted our topic-specific funding opportunities to COVID only. So we weren't going out for education in general. It was, education in COVID. We created a COVID-19 grant opportunity webpage. It's up still. So anything that we found, we put into a centralized webpage. As you can see, that ended up being pretty popular. We saw a 386% page view increase from between April and October over the same time last year. We had about 76,000 page views on that. We put together a packet on funding compliance. So like I said, a grant is, in addition to being awarded it, you have to manage it and make sure that you're hitting your program goals, that your fiscal is correct. Each federal agency and the OMB put out some guidance. So we try to compile that as much as we could to provide grant managers and their managers with like the intent was to have a one-stop place to go to where you could find, what was going on. We also put together a funding observations memo. So as we started seeing like on the ground what was going on, we wanted to provide leadership with some insights that we'd seen. For example, some of the guidance that was coming out was changing, so one of our keys to like help you was to date the guidance that you received, like to keep all of it and to date it. So if you have any issues with funding, you can go back and talk to your federal awarding agency. We have a Nevada grant stakeholders listserv that goes out every 2 weeks where we wrap up any grants that we added to the website. And then we created a blog where we comb through and find like federal guidance on anything grants related to COVID. We will put that on our blog. And so the stakeholders listserv kind of encapsulates that, like what we've done in the past 2 weeks, just trying to keep people informed and having resources to where they could go. We also created a federal COVID-19 funding report. This is where a lot of my time went, was to try and track down what was entering the state and where it was going. This is created in coordination with the governor's office and the governor's finance office. It tracks more than just grants. So you'll see in that number, there are, some of the economic stimulus payments and the loans, but we've tracked so far about $23.7 billion into the state. That's a big report, and we update that bi-weekly as well. Other activities include our grant match fund pilot program. We had this, and we had a staff person dedicated to that in the 2019 legislature. There was a pilot program that was created, to our knowledge, was the first in the nation. We continually heard how lack of grant match funds were causing agencies to regularly skip on applying for grants. So $1 million is allocated to create a program to award any agencies who needed match. And of course, there was like all kinds, we have a business plan and stuff that went through that. We had 31 applications submitted in 3 months. We committed $970,000 of the $1 million in the first 3 months. And then we have one that's been fully executed and awarded, which means they've heard from their funder, from the federal agency, that they were successfully awarded. So we have that one award of $45,000 in match that got a $451,000 grant for the city of North Las Vegas. So a 10-to-1 return on investment. Unfortunately, due to the budget cuts, we reverted back any of the unallocated funds. And then if any of the other 2 awards aren't made by the federal agencies, then we will revert that back to, and our staff member also dropped. We had a grant management system that we've been trying to implement for a couple of cycles. Didn't have any successful RFPs, and so we had put that into putting together a technical study and an RFI to really look at, like what is going on in the state, what agencies have a grant management system, what is an appropriate price tag that we'll need to get what we want. And so unfortunately, we had that study lined up and ready to go, but then also due to COVID and the budget shortfalls, we reverted that back as well. We also do some professional development. We continually heard from our surveys that training is really vital. So we've got, we've aligned training. We've gone out and researched training, and it can be anywhere from like pre-award, so how to write a grant application, to how to monitor subrecipients. Once you award something, it's how do you properly manage that. We did a grant fundamentals training, which was what I was working on. I was going to face-to-face, but then that stopped too. We do have it on YouTube for grant fundamentals, but we're trying to do any professional development we can and get those resources to grant professionals. We also staff the Nevada Advisory Council on Federal Assistance. They were created in 2015. Public, private, and local stakeholders whose responsibility is to look at barriers to grant funding and then make recommendations on how to address those. And so a lot of the legislation that's come from like the Grant Matching Fund pilot program was a recommendation of theirs. I've also included some resources and publications that we've done over the last couple of years. I'm happy to answer any questions on them. You'll see like they kind of run the gamut. We have a grant policy manual that is best practices for state agencies on how to manage a grant. We also had, during COVID, the uniform guidance, which governs how to properly execute grant funds. The Code of Federal Regulations was updated in November 2020. It had some big changes. So in the middle of this, we put together like a summary on that, went through the red line changes so that people would be aware of it and could understand what was changed. So kind of all kinds of stuff there that we have. But again, it's to try and make an educated grant staff. So 2021 and beyond, we were very excited, in the state of the state that is calling to increase federal funding. We participated in a grant roundtable with the governor and the treasurer and other stakeholders, nonprofits, to hear what they were going through in barriers and how we can move forward. We'll continue to solicit and review stakeholder feedback to identify and remove grant barriers. We do have a housekeeping bill, SB 15, in this session that just gives us, it's minor, but it helps. It gives us the authority to develop and maintain a set of policies and procedures for grants. So that'll help keep the state in alignment. And I just wanted to briefly put up a slide that shows, I'm sure you've heard like the complexity of grant funding. So our office deals with discretionary and competitive. That means like there's an application process and generally they're ranked. You'll see, and I know this is a little old, but from year to year, it tends to be the same. So of those that are appropriated, the bulk of the opportunities themselves, about 78%, are discretionary programs, but the majority of funding is in mandatory. So the funding itself, about 75% comes from is in mandatory funds, and our office hasn't delved into that. So there's a lot of opportunity there to look at. And with that, I know that I've shot a lot at you. I hope I didn't do too much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
No, thank you for your presentation. We appreciate that. I know it's a lot. There's no other way to go around it. It is what, well, thank you for joining us this morning. So I know we have a few questions. We'll start off with our vice chair, and then we'll make our way around with other members. Madam Vice Chair, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it and all the work that you're doing to ensure that we are acquiring federal funds. So my question is just about if you could send us some document, you may not have this available right now, but if you could send us a document that just shows how much federal funds we're receiving and where those federal funds are being allocated. I know that there's the bar graph, but if we could have a better idea of the scope of the projects, where we're getting money, and how that, where that money is going to, if they're going to other state offices, and how that money is being spent.
For the record, Erin Hasty, thank you for that question. And that unfortunately is really hard. We don't have that full picture there. We have, some reports that show about 90% of federal funding that I can get you. Part of what we're looking at is, how do we centralize data collection and how do we know what is coming in? So I can send you what I have, but then also know that there's definitely opportunity for us to have a clearer picture of what's going on.
Next, if we could have our Assemblywoman Considine, please.
Thank you, Chair Flores, and thank you for the great presentation. Early on, you said that the Nevada Grant Office was created to help with Nevada's lagging grant performance. So my question is essentially, where does Nevada rank among other states, especially other Western states, in the amount of grant funding that we're getting currently and also pre-COVID, if you have that?
Thank you for the question, Erin Hasty, for the record. I think during that report, we were 50th in the nation. We've fluctuated from the bottom, I think we're at 47th now, according to some models. So we're moving. Medicaid expansion helped bring us up. I can get you what I have, which will probably be the same that the vice chair had, where we're at, which shows, what we bring in per capita. I had one other point that escaped me. I'm sorry, I forgot. If I remember it, I'll come back.
Thank you. Chair, if I may ask a follow-up, or I can wait until everyone
Please
else
follow.
is done.
That's fine. No, please do a follow.
Thank you. Then my follow-up question is, do you have sort of a list or something you can send us giving us the top 5 or 10 barriers? I know that you said that, mandatory matching was one barrier, but if we could know what some of the other barriers are, so maybe we could get above 47.
Thank you. For the record, Erin Hasty, yes, absolutely. We do have those identified, and I will send those to you. And I remember my point, even moving up. So there's been some research that shows even moving up one spot would be an additional $250 million brought in. So it is, it's an effort to move up, but it means when we do that, it's been a big jump. So, but I'm happy to send you the barriers.
Right. Great, thank you. Next, if we could have Assemblywoman Anderson, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I know that it's difficult when you're an interim director and it's just taking over to try to jump in, so really appreciate the information. Quick question. I know that with some grants, there are some entities, let's say that a school district or a county has applied for the grant, then a portion of that grant has to go back to the state. Does that happen at all in these situations, or if a county or school district or other city entity even were to get a grant does the state get a portion of those grants at times as well, or does it go completely to the the local governments that have applied for it?
For the record, Aaron Hasty, I'm not aware of any specifically that go back to the state. There are some what are considered like administrative costs and pass-through grants. So, like for example, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the WIOA dollars, there's some mandates in there that it has to go to the state, and then they pass through those. And then there's some administration that's from there, because the staff even there, like they have to manage that, they have to oversee it, and there's work on their end. So I'm not aware of any, to my knowledge, that I've heard, that you get it and a portion goes to the state. You bring up an interesting point. So like whoever the lead applicant is, and again, this without trying to get too into the weeds, a lead applicant can get the money and then they can choose to subaward it. And of course that depends on what the notice of funding opportunity calls for as well. So if a lead applicant takes some money, they can then choose to, to help meet the goals and deliverables of the grant, can subaward that to other agencies to help carry out that work. Part of our office role has been to help, competing applicants and applications from coming together, because funding opportunities are really competitive. So if we have more than one application per state, that can lessen our chance of getting it. But there's also a lot of work in, like who is going to be like the lead applicant. There can be some contentious stuff sometimes. But like, it's who would be the best to oversee it, who would meet the categorization of funding. And so I don't know if I confused you more or answered your question.
You did, because that's a problem sometimes in contention when it comes to regions. That never happens. Come on. So just kidding, by the way. If I may ask a separate question as well, Chair Flores, it's
Please follow up.
It's
No
not
worries.
in the same topic, but the second question has to do with, are there any grants that Nevada has been awarded for a lengthy period of time that we just now, because we've been receiving this grant for, let's say, 4 years or more, we now depend upon the grants? Are there any grants that we've had for a long period?
For the record, Aaron Hasty, that's a good question. So in the back, there's the formula mandatory, and there are some that have been, here since before I was born, that I'm not aware of, but that's the formula. And so that can be like SNAP or WIC, those programs that are essential and that people have come to rely on. Competitive applications, to my knowledge, I don't know of long-term ones. And again, that's kind of the hard part where we don't have a centralized grant management. I'm not entirely sure like what's out there. There might be some stuff that's done really well that we're just not aware of.
It'd be great to get a
Oh,
list.
and if I could add that, sorry, for the record, Aaron Hasty. So you kind of touched on like supplementing and supplanting. And so a federal, like a competitive grant, it's to assist in services. It's not to replace them. So if you are supplanting, then that's a big no-no.
Agree. So thank you so much. And it'd be great if we could get a list at some point of that. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for your answer.
All right, great. And next we have Assemblyman Ellison, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, if you could, go to item 7, page 7. And one of the things I was looking at was strategies, grant services. It said businesses 76, citizens 67. I'm getting a lot of calls from, and this has been going on since COVID started, where these businesses are applying and they're not getting responses back at all, or they're getting denied. Is there a reason for this? Because these businesses, the employment base, but yet nobody's responding back to them. Then the other question I have is on page 13, unemployment relief, and it says there was 7,247,000 and only awarded 14. So could you answer them two questions for me?
Sure. For the record, Aaron Hasty. So on your first one, our office, we don't oversee or have any insight into the awarding process. We just coordinate with, we'll if we're aware of opportunities, we'll alert people to them. We always refer back to the funder. So constituents will have to refer to the awarding agency. I don't know if it's federal or state, but we don't have any insight into that. They need to contact the funder itself.
Could you give me the information who I need to direct these people to? Because maybe that's the problem, is that they're trying to contact the wrong agencies.
For the record, Aaron Hasty, yeah. And is that the state dollars? Are you the state?
I think
grant?
that's what they're looking for, is states.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, may I interject? This is Laura Freed, for the record, Director of Administration. I think perhaps, through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Ellison, I think perhaps your constituents might be interested in the PETS grants for private businesses, which the grants office doesn't have involvement with. So we would be happy to try and connect your constituents with the right people, but in this case, that's not the grants office.
Okay. Yeah. If I can get that information or what I need to do to get it, because we're getting a lot of calls and a lot of upset people throughout the whole state. I even had people in small business out of Clark County call me. I don't know why they're calling me, but we're trying to help if we can. But that's an issue that's coming up. And then the other issue is page 13, the unemployment relief program, and we're constantly getting the calls trying to get help. So I don't know if this is something we need, because Dieter don't answer the damn phones. Hate to say it, but when I've seen this up here, it says federal COVID fund by category, and you look at the unemployment and $7 million, and there's only 14 awarded. Can you explain that?
Sure. For the record, Aaron Hasty. So for the unemployment relief, and that's actually in thousands, so that's 7.2 billion.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It's not that clear.
Yeah.
So it's for the record, that I have the more detailed, it does break it down. I'd be happy to get you like our detailed report. That includes unemployment, like the PUA, and any direct payments that are in unemployment. That's the big bulk, but I can get you the complete breakdown, because we do have that in that report.
I really appreciate that a lot, because I think that'll help answer some of these questions. But as far as the people trying to get help for 7 months and they can't get a phone call back, let alone try to get food for the families, it's ridiculous. So anyway, if you can give me that. And then the other thing is I think that we got to do something with a direct line with Dieter, because you can go on the phone for hours and hours and never get somebody to pick up a phone. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, members. And I know that particularly with that comment, Assemblyman Ellison is definitely sharing some of the frustrations that we're getting from so many constituents. And I think like like Assemblyman Ellison, we don't necessarily always know who the right office we got to send them to. So I understand.
Chair, if I may,
Yes.
we'd be happy, and we do, when citizens reach out to us, like we'll track so they can get like a live phone number. So, if you get that, we're happy to try and track that down as well.
We appreciate that. And we recognize that a lot of those concerns raised in no way come directly to you. But again, I think it's just so many constituents have called, and I think folk are just trying to figure out where to send them. So thank you. Next, we have Assemblyman Matthews, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Hasty, thanks so much for being with us this morning and for your great presentation. I have a question that I think is sort of related to the question that Assemblywoman Anderson asked. She touched on the question of grant recipients sort of coming to depend and rely a bit on the funds they get. I'm wondering, in the event that grant money does come to a particular recipient, and after a given period of time, that grant money, were to go away, how common is it? And I understand it may be difficult to answer this in a general sense, but when these grant recipients no longer have access to that funding they're used to what extent do they seek and succeed in seeking that funding from other governmental sources, particularly the state? In other words, to what extent does the state end up sort of replacing the funds that previously were coming from, in the form of a grant? I'm just kind of wondering if it's common for this to end up being a liability to the state financially. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the record, Erin Hasty. With that, actually, a state investing in resources in the programs makes it more competitive and makes it more likely for funds to come to us to begin with. They also, like a lot of federal grants, like to see leveraging federal dollars. And so, sometimes when we put resources in, they'll give us more back. Like I can give an example in 2015, the Breakfast After the Bell program that was created used $2 million in state general fund and to help school districts and schools provide free and provide lunch and breakfast if a certain school reached, I think 70% federal poverty level. Meals would be provided for all students. And so with that $2 million, they were able to then get reimbursed about $5 million from the federal Department of Agriculture. And so generally what I've seen is the more that we invest, the more that we get back. But to your point, if there is an opportunity that creates resources and it's not funded, that's not sustainable. And then I haven't seen, to my knowledge, the state get put on the hook for anything. From what I've seen, it's been like the more that we put in, the more that we're able to take back. But to make us competitive from the opportunities that I've seen, that funders do like to see that there's going to be continuity of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. For the most part, yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Laura Freed, Director of Administration again. I wanted to add on to what Ms. Hasty had to say. In the context of the state budget, as Ms. Hasty previously testified, a lot of the grant funds that state agencies get are formula grant funds, so they can expect to get them year after year, as long as there's not, the federal audit findings aren't there and things like that, and they, file all their paperwork correctly. We as a state get relatively few competitive awards, and which I think is what Ms. Hasty was really addressing her comments to. So to the extent, and I'm speaking sort of in the budget context because that's my background, to the extent that we do continue to match or provide the MOE, we do generally get those competitive grants year after year. But of course, I have seen it when the federal funds dried up. And to answer your question, it's not common in the budget context to, for instance, use general fund or highway fund or some other kind of state funds to backfill lost federal grants. I mean, in the olden days of the budget, the chair of Ways and Means used to have a phrase: when the grant goes away, the program goes away. And that's more or less continued to be true.
Thank you.
And next we have Assemblywoman Brown May, please.
Thank you, Chair Flores. I do have a couple of questions, and I appreciate the comments about the differences between competitive grants and the match fund dollars that come out of the federal government. So it's, I think, a really important distinction to make in that they are two very separate things. First, I want to congratulate the Grants Office on all of the great work that you've done over the last couple of years. It's been wonderful to see the growth and the collaboration in the community. I think the training has been essential. And while we still have a competitive nature, I'm sure, with many organizations that are vying for those federal dollars, I think the more times they come to the table to talk about where they are more alike than different, we're able to bring additional competitive dollars into the state. So I think that's been successful, and I want to congratulate you on that. To that end, though, I'm curious to know what tools do you need to help bring additional federal dollars in? Because we know that we are at the very end. Have we given any consideration to fundraising private entities and as a way to supplement some of that federal match dollar or to assist in some of those competitive grant processes? So that would be my first question. How does that help us draw additional federal dollars down where there is a match? I think the other thing that's really important to repeat again, Ms. Hasty, is how you talked about supplementing funding as opposed to supplanting the funding. And in a competitive grant cycle, if you don't have a new program to create to draw down dollars, you just don't qualify. So how do we help organizations to create that new programming to meet the need? And I think following up on Assemblyman Matthews' comments relative to the food program and the way you responded there, I think that was a great example. So thank you for providing that. And then the third part of that is how do we centralize that data collection, right? So if we don't know exactly how much federal dollars we're bringing in, even into private organizations or nonprofit entities, how then do we know really where do we fall? And are they able to access those funds? So I apologize for the number of questions, but I do appreciate the detail.
Thank you. For the record, Erin Hasty, and I'm trying to jot down, but please cut me off like if I didn't get it. So I think the first one is how do we kind of collaborate with the philanthropic community or private to help increase grant match. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. Okay, so for the record, that's a great point. I know that we were interested if the grant match fund continued, like to leverage the philanthropic community to put some money into that. And now that we have the data to show that there is a return on investment, for that one that we awarded, it was $10 back for every $1 invested. And so the conversations are nascent, but moving forward, bringing them to the table is going to be vital and definitely something that's on our radar. Centralized data collection, and I know I'm missing one. I missed the second, sorry, but the centralized data collection, I think, unfortunately, we weren't able to award a grant management system, and with a budget this session, it's just not practical. But having a grant management system would really help to identify what we have there. So hopefully in the future, right now we just have, like the collaboration that we have, patched Excel sheets that we're, like that's where the outreach is really important, is to try and understand what's going on. But that's a lot of legwork. So people know about us, know to come to us, know to report to us. So it's not perfect. There's definitely room for improvement there. And I apologize. I didn't get that. I think I missed the second part of your question.
That's all right. Thank you, Chair. If I could just have one follow-up question, it would really be relative to that piece, right? Is there a way that we can even fundraise through private foundations to develop the analysis, how do we collect the data? Is there a way that we can engage other philanthropic organizations to get us what we need to bring more money into the state? Without the data, we're not going to get more money. So how do we get the data without having to state fund that through general fund dollars?
Perfect. Thank you. For the record, Erin Hasty, and I like where you're going. I'd be happy, can we connect with you to work on that, because our office is allowed to accept grants and gifts. So, if there was a willing organization who was willing to do that and we can find that, we would be happy to look into that. But I'd be happy to connect with you too.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Flores.
All right, great. And our final question is from Assemblywoman Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chairman Flores. I appreciate the presentation from Ms. Hasty and Director Freed. I do have a question in reference to our veterans. I know that Nevada is seeking federal grants, and I want to know whether or not we are applying for on behalf of our vets. There are issues that, i.e. Housing, job training, behavioral health care, and our biggest problem is with the veterans community is suicide prevention. So I want to know whether or not we have any data. Have grants been, if you have applied for them, have we not received anything? And if you have that data, hope that you would share it with us.
For the record, Erin Hasty, I would be happy to pull our data of what we've been notified on. So I can definitely pull that and get that to you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
All right, thank you. And I wanted to say thank you again for that great presentation. And I think it was a great conversation we engaged in. We could probably spend another couple hours here. So thank you, members, and thank you both for being here. Members, as always, I encourage you to reach out to them offline, continue this conversation. This is just the very first. For many of you, it's a continuing conversation. So again, thank you. With that, we're going to go ahead and close out the presentation by the Department of Administration Office of Grant Procurement. And next, we're going to open up the presentation by the Department of Public Safety. So I believe we have our chief, Mr. Fogerson.
Good morning, Chair.
Good morning.
Thank you. Dave Fogerson, I'm the Division Chief for Emergency Management and Homeland Security. And with me today, I have Justin Luna, our Administrative Services Officer. We do have a presentation to provide to you, if you're willing to accept it, that describes how awesome our organization here is.
Sounds great. Just because you use the word awesome.
So we are the Department of Public Safety, the Division of Emergency Management, and the Office of Homeland Security. And in this photo, it's obviously a pre-COVID photo, but shows you the emergency operations center that we do manage here at the state for disasters and emergencies. And we'll get into how we use this, when we use this, and why we use this in this presentation. Our vision is we want to be Nevada's essential emergency and disaster coordinated partner. And in this presentation, you're going to see a lot of pictures. And many of these pictures, you're going to see a lot of people from different organizations involved. That's one of the big things we do. And up in the upper right screen, you can see that Division of Emergency Management is in a center, but you can see all the different people that we coordinate and work with the governor's office, local and tribal emergency management, our contiguous states, the volunteer groups, our faith-based communities, private sectors, federal agencies, FEMA, and then state agencies that the federal government calls the state agencies that assist us emergency support functions, such as emergency support function 8 is for health. We prefer to call them essential support functions because we would not be able to do our job without them. And so this vision is pretty important to us, and these pictures of seeing how well we work with each other is pretty important to our concept of operations here at the division. Our mission, we are coordinating mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery programs, and resources through partnerships to sustain life in livable communities for Nevada's residents and visitors. And again, you see another keyword there, those partnerships. It's a very small organization. We only have 40 full-time employees. Everybody else that works with us, we're leveraging the ability of these other organizations to move forward to help us help our communities. We do have 3 strategic goals. We want to be an efficient team strengthened by collaboration, communication, and leadership, which is really important because when in disasters, people are stressed. We have to rely upon the collaboration we built before the disaster. We have to be able to communicate well and over communicate to get through some of those stressors And we have to be able to provide that strong strategic leadership of where we're going as a group. We're an essential partner in the coordination of emergency and disaster resources for the whole community. And FEMA developed this a few years ago, calling it the whole community approach, or all of community, where we're dealing with the private sector, nonprofits, educational sector, and government. So that way everybody's in it together and not one sector has to solve everyone's problems. And we want to be the statewide leader sustaining and building emergency disaster response capacity. And again, you see more pictures where we have a lot of disparate people working together, and that really is the heart of what emergency management does. So let's clarify who Division of Emergency Management is not. We are not field responders. We're not public works. We're not firefighter paramedics. We're not law enforcement officers. We're not the first responders out there in the field doing the job. We're not the first line of defense. We're not involved in every emergency, and we don't have grant money without strings. And we'll talk about that statement here coming up. So our role isn't to actually do the job. Our role is to support those that are doing the job. If you figure that when you call 911, you are calling 911 to get a law enforcement officer, you're calling 911 to get a firefighter paramedic to your house for an assistant. Those are the people that call us, and so we are 911 for public safety in Nevada. We do have a nationally accredited emergency management program, one of the few states in the nation with such a program. And we do have two communities in Nevada, Washoe County and the city of Henderson, also meeting those national accreditation standards. We look at ourselves as the second line of defense for our local and tribal governments. Like I was talking before, the public calls 911 to get the local government for help. We are 911 for that local government to help support their operations. We play the role between federal programs and state and local and tribal government programs to be that intermediary force to get some better collaboration and be the explanation point for some of those descriptors of programs that might be confusing to people. We pride ourselves on being the group that knows the right person involved. We answer that phone when local government calls for help, and we pride ourselves on knowing the right state agency, the right private resource to call to get them the assistance they need. We're collaborators and coordinators. We love getting people together and sharing the information so that way everybody's on the same page moving forward. And especially when you look at the disaster end with COVID, we run multiple coordination calls to make sure that everybody's in the loop on everything going on, regardless of what level of government they're involved with, to make it clear, concise, and fair for everybody. We're a grant funding opportunity for local and tribal governments and some private nonprofits. We do planning, training, and exercise to prepare local government and our private nonprofit partners for disaster. We have mitigation recovery assistance specialists. So we look not only for the funding to help them, but we also have some technical specialists to find out how do we mitigate the risk. Emergency management really is risk management for disasters. And so we look at how do we buy down that risk? How do we reduce the threat to Nevada? And can we mitigate that by having a better safe building, by helping with some fire codes or building codes, by improving some dam safety issues. We also work on statewide interoperability resource. If you call 911, the firefighters that died in the towers, one of the issues that came up was law enforcement knew the towers were compromised and were able to exit, but they were unable to communicate with the firefighters because of some radio issues. So following 9/11, the federal government decided to have every state have a statewide interoperability coordinator to see how we communicate better between the agencies using radio technology. We've pushed that very far now. Now we're looking at data because not only do we talk between our career fields and on the radios, we also use a lot of data systems to make sure we can share that data between them so that way the right person has the right information at the right time. We do a lot of resource tracking. We do a tremendous amount of resource relationship building because we want to be able to be the person that knows the person to call when someone needs help. And we're also the state point of contact for Department of Homeland Security when they have a Homeland Security concern. To do all that, our process in emergency management, we want to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover. our number one goal is to prevent something from occurring. And that really focuses on our Homeland Security side, where we're trying to prevent the next incident from occurring. That could also work on some natural disaster side, where we try to prevent a disaster from occurring by reducing its effects. We try to protect our communities by giving the adequate resources to be ready for that disaster. We try to mitigate the risk. We have hazard mitigation funds we'll talk about in a minute that we can give to local communities or assist them in getting additional funds from the federal government to make their communities safer. Some of these mitigation funds have gone to find generators for shelters that local communities would use for shelter evacuees in a disaster. Some of the money has gone to improving flood control basins in rural communities. Right now, the big one we have is a city hall retrofit to make sure that it will withstand an earthquake. And then the cool part that everyone always thinks about is that respond part. And as I talked before, our local governments are doing the response part. We respond by supporting them in the Emergency Operations Center or through a duty officer program. And then we worry about recovery. We find out ways to get money to alleviate the damage and the threat and get the community better. And recovery is kind of mixed a little bit with mitigation, because when we recover from that disaster, we also want to use those funds to make us more resilient to prevent the next disaster that occurs from being as severe as the last. Emergencies are always locally executed, state directed, and federally supported. So our local governments are always the sharp end of our stick. At the state, our job is to coordinate those resources that they need to do their job, and then we look to the federal government for that support that we need to help our locals out. And if you look at our COVID disaster right now, it's a great example of what we're doing. Locally, we have the local health authorities and the local county authorities doing the vaccination clinics. The states come up with the playbook. The state provided resources and funding for those local governments to be able to do their job. And then we look to the federal government for additional funding streams, along with people. Just this morning, we had some people from USDA show up here at the state to help us do vaccinations in the Clark County region. We've got 130 FEMA employees in Clark County helping with that vaccination effort. And so that's how we run that. So we have definitive lines of authority between who does what. So we don't get into trouble when we start blurring those lanes. Our organization is very small but mighty. We have the Homeland Security part of our office with Karen Hall as our Homeland Security Program Manager. And then we have two FTEs that work with her. We have a preparedness section with John Backendall. And this is, we call it preparedness because they work on planning, training, exercises, but they're also kind of the operations component. Right now, through the COVID disaster, John Shop is what's leading the State Emergency Operations Center through helping our local governments. We have grants recovering and mitigation section led by Kelly Anderson. And this section has probably the biggest lift of any of them because they have to worry about the annual recurring grants we get from the federal government for Homeland Security and Emergency Management. But then when we do have a disaster, now they get the added responsibility of those recovery grants and working on the mitigation programs for the future. Our finance administration section led by Justin Luna is the ones that make sure that everything works correctly for us and keeps all of us towing the line correctly. And then we have Melissa Friend, who is in charge of our interoperability section that does all of our technology here at the EOC and helping our local partners with how do we share data, how do we share the radio communications that need to be shared between everybody. We have a large group of partners. Our biggest partner is the Nevada National Guard. The State Emergency Operations Center is actually on the National Guard base in Carson City, and our building is jointly shared between the Joint Operations Center for the National Guard, who's responsible for their domestic operations, and then our operations in State EOC. Their assistance, especially during COVID, has been invaluable because of the resource pool that they can provide for staffing, but then also their ability to do some long-range planning. We've really tapped into to help us write a disease outbreak management plan, to help us write a sustainment plan, help us write those various plans that we need to develop in order to get everyone on the same page moving forward. The Division of Public and Behavioral Health are phenomenal partners. They really are kind of if you can't find an emergency or disaster that doesn't have some kind of health issue related to it. And so public and behavioral health and emergency management are tied at the hips to make sure that we respond appropriately and message correctly. And then every state agency has a different role in emergency operations center, as I talked about before with those essential support functions. Department of Transportation, if we have an incident like right now, during COVID, Department of Transportation is involved with helping us find ways to transport resources. If we have an earthquake, Department of Transportation is involved with the roadway issues, with the rail issues, with air traffic, because that's all their bailiwick and they are the subject matter experts. That way we don't have to become the subject matter experts. And we have recovery support functions as well, where now we have the Governor's Office of Economic Development. We have Housing and Urban Development in there. So that way we can see ways to get our state back in order and make it correct for our citizens. And in every local government, whether it's a city, a special district, or a county, we have connections to every single one of them to make sure that we are meeting their needs. And we meet with them, like I talked about with the COVID thing, or COVID incident. Every week we're doing coordination calls with all these entities. We also reach out to them on regular basis to make sure that we're helping support their needs. We have volunteers active and organized in disasters, the American Red Cross, Team Rubicon. All of those people are humongous partners with us to help us move forward. We work with Nevada's 27 recognized tribal nations. We have 2 employees that work through the Nevada Emergency Tribal Coordinating Council here in our office. One is paid for from emergency management funds. One's paid for from public and behavioral health funds. So that way we can make sure that our tribal nations have their emergency management and their public health needs met. And then of course on the federal level, FEMA, and FEMA is a tremendous partner for us. They're actually embedded in our EOC right now. We have a full-time employee that is here year-round, regardless of disasters, to help us figure out how to move emergency management and how do we make Nevada more resilient. Because of COVID, we have an additional probably 10 employees that are detailed just at the State Emergency Operations Center to help us coordinate between the federal government, the state government, and the local governments. Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense are all 3 key players, especially when we start looking at some of the other parts of what we do in emergency management to spread some money because of the threat of radiation concern that we do have in Southern Nevada and Eastern Nevada from some of the roadways that are traveled. And again, you can see pictures of the partnerships that we have. A picture of a testing pod early on in the COVID incident in the Quad Counties, where we have National Guardsmen that are there helping local government to test the population. We have a picture there of a food bank encounter we did. One of the issues that the tribal nations came to us, the Nevada Indian Commission came to us with, that they were having trouble getting elders food during COVID. And so we partnered with Nevada Indian Commission, the Intertribal Coordinating Council, NTEC, and food banks in order to get that food out in those right places. And then we have a huge component of public education. And on the right is fire shelter trainings that we're helping our local fire department students and media partners. So that way those media partners can then go out to wildland fires and report on what the local partners are doing in a safe manner. Division of Emergency Management is mentioned in a lot of NRSs. It's actually amazing. I took the position in October coming from local government, and I asked our DAG to find me all the NRSs where we're mentioned. And I was very shocked when I got this very large book of every place that Division of Emergency Management is listed. The big ones to raise your attention to is 239C, just the NRS on Homeland Security. And this talks about our Homeland Security roles and how we better protect our state from those threats and how we interact with our local partners to make sure that they have what they need to keep them safe. 353 is state finance. We do have a disaster relief account that local governments can petition the division and then the legislature to have funds out of it should a disaster occur and it exceeds their ability to meet that. Obviously, we haven't had to reach that yet with COVID because of all the federal assistance we have been receiving. But in a normal emergency incident, it's not uncommon for a local government to produce a request to get some disaster relief account funds. NRS 414 is really our main bread and butter for our legal authority. This describes our division and all of our responsibilities. And 414A talks about our interstate mutual aid. This is really important because we pushed this a few years ago. And I was on the local government side helping with it at the time, because this eliminated the need for mutual aid agreements by any local government, that they're all immediate partners to a mutual aid plan, so they can all share resources when they need something without having to worry about any of the legal authorities. We took care of that through the NRS. So funding of the division, we are 95% federally grant supported. And we have a number of major programs here we work through. The first one being the Emergency Management Performance Grant. And this one is $4.6 million that the state gets from the federal government, and we split it 50-50 with local governments. And so that 50% of that stays here with the Division of Emergency Management, the other 50% of it is spread to our local governments. That way they can manage an emergency management program themselves. We get $222,000 from the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Grant, and that's for that tribal partnership of how to help and make that a better, more resilient program for our tribal nation. Homeland Security Grant Program, Division of Emergency Management keeps $1.6 million out of a $10.5 million allocation. Majority of these funds go to Southern Nevada in order to make sure that our tourism capital and our population center has what they need to keep themselves safe. We have an agreement in principle with the Department of Energy, and we do keep a majority of those funds for training and education of first responders in the state related to nuclear and radiation items. We have an emergency preparedness working group that gets $638,000 from the federal government. And this majority of this does flow to our local governments in order to have them prepared for any type of radiological emergency on the highways as it travels. The waste isolation pilot plan gives us $200,000, and we do keep all of that, and that goes in that radiation training account. Pre-disaster mitigation program. This is probably the coolest one that we have. We have $100,000 that we use to manage that mitigation program, but we get $925,000 from the federal government as almost a guarantee every year for us to select how to help our local governments mitigate risk. And this is where we look at how do we improve flood control? How do we reduce the risk of your city hall collapsing in an earthquake? And then that is also able to get more funds on a competitive process nationally in order, if we do have good projects, to keep feeding through. And then the big part of what we do is that public assistance grants. So every time we have a disaster that's been declared by the state, declared by the federal government, we get the ability to get public assistance grants for local and state projects to make the public side whole again. And so when they say public, this is always confusing because you think the general public. This is all really government assistance. This is how do we rebuild the school after it collapses. This is how do we pay for the PPE that we need for COVID. And you can see there at the bottom that we do get 7% of these grants for management costs. So if we get $200 million worth of public assistance grants, we get 7% of that back to the state. So that way we can have employees to manage those grant programs. So between DEM and what we give out to our local partners, we keep $5.1 to $5.7 million to run our operations out of a total of 17.9. So the majority of what we get from the federal government, we can pass through to our locals. So that way they are ready to respond and we don't have to work as hard to help them when that disaster occurs. We do have a number of public bodies that we're responsible to oversee. We oversee the Commission on Homeland Security and the Subcommittee on Finance. We oversee the Nevada Resilience Advisory Committee. And this is probably our crowning glory. We have approximately 30 members on this Nevada Resilience Advisory Committee from local government, from private nonprofits, from different state agencies. And their role is to advise the chief's position on how do we make Nevada more resilient for disaster. And so we use this as a vetting group for grant projects. That way everyone gets a chance to vet and to have a voice in what projects that we want to push forward. And we have the subject matter experts on that committee provide good advice to us. We have the Nevada Tribal Emergency Coordinating Council. And this is all the tribes and myself and we get together once a quarter in order to talk about tribal emergency related issues and make those tribes more resilient and make our state more resilient as a result. We have the State Disaster Identification Coordination Committee, and that's what part of our subject of our bill that I'll present here when we're done with this presentation is about. The State Disaster Identification Coordination Committee is designed to help our coroner's offices and our medical examiners better communicate and collaborate together. And it's an odd group that it is not subject to the open meeting law because of some of the subjects that that group has to talk about and some of the people that they do discuss named times. And so that actually is not covered by the Nevada open meeting law and is expressly protected in the NRS for that reason. And some of the conversation we have in that, it just really isn't for the most people to want to hear. And then we have the Nevada Interstate Mutual Aid Committee. And this committee was formed after we did the 414A law. So that way we can coordinate between public works, law enforcement, fire service, emergency medical services, and the various government groups. How do we get that mutual aid to somebody? So when there's an incident in Clark County, how do we flex some resources from the rest of the state? When there's an incident in Elko, how do we get them help without damaging the rest of the system? And then COVID. I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a great slide about COVID. And again, you can see all the groups that we have here at COVID. You can see the picture of one of the two warehouses we have with the stock of PPE that we're holding on to and pushing out when requested from local governments to make sure that every healthcare provider in the state of Nevada has the personal protective equipment they need to keep them safe in this disaster. You can see the partnerships in the center there where we're doing the vaccine starting at one of the Washington County pods. The upper right is a vaccine pod in the middle of the snow. The lower right is a vaccine pod in a little more nice time of year. And then some of those partnerships we have, Southwest Airlines is actually working with us to move some of our product north and south to help us get the right equipment at the right place at the right time at no cost. It's been a great partnership for them to share with us. So our responsibility really is that logistics piece for the warehousing of PPE, the warehousing of testing supplies, how to test, helping with vaccinations, helping with the personnel, the equipment, and then being that coordinator of all those different folks that are involved in this discussion to get us out of this pandemic. So some more examples of what we do. We run a duty officer program. There's always an emergency manager that's on call. So that way when local government needs help, someone answers that phone. Primarily, we do a lot with search and rescue assistance. And so when there's a search and rescue that's responsible to the sheriff of the county, when they need assistance, they need aircraft, they need support from the military, they need support from someone that can help them with some additional skills they might not have, we're that conduit to it. The duty officer can also get intra and interstate mutual aid for all hazards. So if we have an earthquake, if we have a large structure fire, they can move those resources around for us very easily. And then they're the first line of notification for incidents. After the duty officer program, when we exceed their ability to manage that incident, then we open an emergency operations center. There's a couple of pictures here on the left that are both pre-COVID that show what our emergency operations center looks like. And this is where we bring in the various state agencies and our private nonprofits to assist us in managing that incident. We do coordination calls with jurisdictions. We serve as the state's risk manager through that disaster to help our local government partners out, to help the public survivors get back to normal. We coordinate those state and federal resources, and then following the disaster, we start working on it. And actually not following disaster, but during the disaster, we're working on the recovery part. How do we get money flowing to those local communities to get them back open? We manage 2 state incident management teams. Right now, we are in the process of working to develop both of those. Those were requirements of NRS last session, and we're still underway with making those happen. We manage the interoperability communication program, and we manage the radiation and waste isolation pilot program. We manage a lot of pre-incident grant activities to buy down our risk, and we talked about these with the Homeland Security Grant Program, the Urban Area Security Initiative. This is a special designation that we received for Clark County in order for them to have their special carve out of funds from the federal government to make sure that we keep the Las Vegas community safe. Emergency Management Program grant to keep emergency management working, and that pre-disaster mitigation. Normally, these grants all about $17.9 million that we're managing. And then we do post-disaster declaration grant programs, the public assistance we talked about. This year, Division of Emergency Management is managing over $200 million in grants. And we've been able to expand our staff through an interim finance committee, allowed us to add 3 grant project analysts and then 3 administrative assistants to help them to manage all of these additional grants that we're getting that are kind of unheard of because of COVID. And all those employees are 100% federally funded. So that way we don't have to worry about any state costs coming from them. And in closing, I wouldn't be your emergency manager if I didn't ask you and your family have a plan and a kit to survive for 72 hours. If you go to www.ready.gov, you can learn what you need to do to make that plan and make that kit. And you should have a plan and a kit for your house and for your work, for something in your car, especially with the extreme weather conditions we have either in the north with snow or in the south with our heat and our wind conditions that we have down there. Our top risks in Nevada are earthquake, wildland fire, flood, severe storm, extreme heat, drought, and pandemic. So I would urge everyone to know how they're going to respond and take care of themselves should one of those events happen and affect you personally. And I'm open to any and all questions, and I would love if any legislators would ever like to come take a tour of our State Emergency Operations Center. We'll make that happen. Thank you.
And thank you for that presentation. I know there was a lot of material we went through there, and thank you for all the work you're doing. And I'll take this personal point of privilege here to say thank you to Mr. Ryan Gerchman there at your office. I know about 8-9 months ago through the Nevada Hispanic Legislative Caucus, we had a food initiative, and you helped us secure, or he helped us secure, better said, masks for a lot of families who desperately needed them. So we're just incredibly grateful for that tremendous amount of work that you've been doing, and for being actively out there working with the community and identifying vulnerable community members. So thank you. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out to him. So members, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions at this time. I want to make sure that I don't miss anybody here. I don't see any immediate questions now. But members, if feel comfortable to unmute yourself, should I have missed somebody. If I could, we'll open it up with Assemblywoman Black, please.
I was just, I guess this is more of a clarifying question. Are we going to go through the Nevada Resilience Advisory Committee information, or is that, because I'm seeing 2 different sets of paperwork here?
Yes, Assemblywoman. Once we do the presentation on the bill itself, we'll go into further detail at that point. If you had overarching, just broad questions about that, I'm sure they could answer those. Otherwise, we can wait for the bill itself.
No, that's fine. I was just trying to understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Members, any additional questions?
Assemblymember Anderson, I do have one, if I may.
Assemblywoman, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the information, Chief Fulgerson. And maybe I missed this portion. Is there any hacking sort of programs? Because we're seeing more and more computer hacking taking place at the local and state government concerns. So I didn't know if that was under your department or a different department.
Thank you, ma'am. David Fulgerson for the record. The Department of Public Safety does have an Office of Cybersecurity, and that division takes care of that. We do fund them through some Homeland Security funds we get from the federal government. That is primarily in their section. We do stay very heavily connected and involved because of the threat. I'm sure you saw in the media, someone was able to hack into a water system in Florida and change some of the components that were added to the water that would have made it hazardous. So we stay very well in tune with that, with the Nevada Threat Assessment Center, the Office of Cybersecurity, and then with our federal partners, but it is the responsibility primarily of the Office of Cybersecurity.
Thank you for that clarification.
Great, members. I don't think we have any other questions, but if you do, please unmute yourself.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I had one.
Assemblyman Ellison, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was one slide at the very, very end, and it showed for families preparedness. I think that's great, and I think that needs to be out more to the public because anything can happen: floods, fires, earthquakes, tornadoes, whatever. But a bug out bag that you showed in there was great, and I think that like radios, emergency radios, crank radios or whatever, but emergencies happen everywhere. And people take it for granted thinking that it's not going to happen or grid's up or whatever, but you had a thing on there for 72 hours. And I still think that should be more out to the public to let them know to be more prepared than what they are for a disaster. Could you respond? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, sir. David Fogerson for the record. Absolutely. And the last year we've been very involved with COVID with our public information officer managing the state joint information center. We were able to just move her back from the COVID response to normal response. And so we are going to start getting back into public messaging for that all hazard response, because that really is where some of that mitigation and that protection exists by making sure our public knows what the threats are and how they can prepare themselves for that threat. So I love your comments, sir, and I appreciate your assistance.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Assemblyman. And thank you again for the presentation. I'm sure we'll dive into a lot deeper questions here with the bill. With that, I'd like to close out the presentation by the Division of Emergency Management and Office of Homeland Security. And next, I'd like to open up our bill hearing on Assembly Bill 14, which revises provisions relating to emergency management. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. David Fogerson, Chief of Division of Emergency Management and Homeland Security for the record. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you Assembly Bill 14. This bill draft cleans up some existing language that Division of Emergency Management has found problems with over the last 2 years. The first cleanup item relates to two of our public bodies, the Nevada Resilience Advisory Committee, which I provided you the annual report, so that way you can see what that committee actually does and how hard that committee does work for our state, and the Tribal Emergency Coordinating Council. We propose in the bill to change the required meeting frequency to a quarterly basis. NRAC is required to meet monthly right now in NRS, and especially during the COVID pandemic, that became difficult not only for the state to manage, but also for our local partners to attend and for us to obtain a quorum. And so we're recommending that we move that committee to a quarterly basis, or at the meet of the call the chair. We propose changing the Tribal Emergency Coordinating Council to call the chair, but not less than once every quarter, to ensure that we're also continuing to meet our tribal members' needs. This will ensure we're in constant communication with all of our partners. The next change we propose is about the State Disaster Identification Coordinating Committee. The current language relates to items that are addressed by our local jurisdictions. We removed much of the language that is responsible to our local partners. We learned this through the COVID pandemic, where we've had this committee meet numerous times to discuss the issues regarding mass fatality. We need to keep the committee in existence due to the ability to coordinate these mass fatality needs, but we like to remove the provisions that are a local and not state responsibility. We do appreciate your consideration of a proposed bill draft and are open for any questions you may have.
So they're not going to talk.
All right. And thank you for that quick walkthrough. Members, I know that you had an opportunity to review the bill itself. And at this time, I'd like to give members the opportunity to ask questions. And I believe our Vice Chair, Madam Vice Chair, please, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation and for your presentation of the bill as well. So I just wanted to kind of understand, if there was going to be any, I see that the Nevada Tribal Emergency Coordinating Council is impacted by these decisions as well, and I want to know if they've been part of this conversation and if they're supportive of this bill.
Question. We've had conversations at that committee to discuss these changes to make sure that everyone's in agreement with it. We're not changing anything really with them on their meeting basis. It's always been quarterly. We're just cleaning up the language on how it says that it is a quarterly meeting ensure everyone's clear on that.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. If next we could please do, I don't know if Assemblywoman Black, if your request for a question was from the previous presentation or if you wanted to tackle a question now.
No, I do have a question now, if I
Please
can
do.
answer that. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to preface my comments here by saying I am in favor of less committees, less committee meetings in general, but I'm a little leery of any reduction in emergency response during a COVID or any other sort of pandemic. So I have several questions, but my main question is, and my concern is the reporting from the health agencies when someone comes through with an illness or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm stepped away from my computer, so I'm kind of jumbled, but that's my main concern. Can you address that?
Yes, ma'am. I believe you're talking about David Fogerson for the record, sorry. I believe you're talking about the components of the State Disaster Identification Coordination Committee. And we did remove that from the responsibility of that committee because that's not what that committee does. That committee is responsible for organizing the mass fatality efforts. That requirement that they do those other items are all done already by our local medical examiners in either Washoe County or Clark, or by our coroners from our rural communities. And so by putting it in here that Division of Emergency Management had to do it, we're duplicating what was already done at a local level and stepping on some toes between the two of us. So we want to keep that committee to exist and continue those conversations, but we also don't want to take over any of their legal responsibilities and ensure that we support them and not duplicate their efforts.
Next, we have Assemblyman Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And when I'm reading this bill, AB 14, this is a bill that basically it becomes law, and it doesn't say it does expire. So this thing could go on for eternity. My problem is that right now, when the people need committees, people to talk to and people to listen to, we shouldn't be closing committees. We should be open doors for the people, not closing them. And I understand where their problem is. I really do, because I'm involved with a lot of these tribes out there. But my problem is a lot of these people don't get heard. And I really believe this is going to hurt in the long run. And the other thing is, this shouldn't have been a bill. It should have been something through administration, just allow it to go for 1 year or something, but not a bill and a law. And that's my problem with this. And if you can answer that, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the question, sir. David Fogerson, for the record. Absolutely concur. Our intent here is not to stop the conversations, because those conversations, especially during the pandemic, were occurring weekly through the coordination calls with all of our communities. And we do that with every disaster. When we had the Pine Haven incident with the city of Reno, when they declared a disaster, we had 2 or 3 coordination calls with just those local jurisdictions that were affected by that disaster. So we're always doing that. What this is doing is specifically on the Nevada Resilience Advisory Committee. It's right now in statute as requiring a monthly meeting. And the committee members and the division all had the discussion and the agreement that meeting monthly is a little too much for the workload of those committee members, given the size of the committee. And so that's why we're proposing we meet once a quarter, or at the chair, or at the call of the chair. So if there is something we do need to discuss and address, such as right now we're in the middle of the Homeland Security grant process. So if this was in effect right now, we would probably still be meeting January, February, March to make it through the grant process, but then would be able to do quarterly if we didn't have business to obtain to. So it doesn't remove our ability to communicate with our partners, and it doesn't diminish our dramatic desire to do that outreach. It still gives us an opportunity, but takes away that level of requiring it once a month that has been burdensome to the committee members and the division.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Please follow up.
And for just clarification, this would be, it'd be quarterly, but, and if it went quarterly versus, because most committees or most boards are quarterly out in the rural areas anyway, isn't that not?
David Fogerson for the record. I'm not sure if most are, but at the division, most of our committees are quarterly, at least within the division. I'm not sure about other divisions. And the Tribal Emergency Coordinating Committee is a quarterly meeting already. We're cleaning up language that way it mirrors what we're proposing for the Resilience Committee, moving that to the quarterly basis.
Okay, and then if you look on item 3 or item, well, that jumps over, but at 2 and 3 on page 3, it says at least once every 3 months, and that's crossed off as frequent as required to performance duties. That I don't like, but it says not less than once a year, once a quarter. So if the quarter's in there, then why didn't you just make that it's every quarter versus not less than? So I don't know, but I'm going to look at this and give it some brainstorming. But like I said, I still think that the public needs to be aware of and what goes on out there. And I don't like the from quarter to the year on page 4. So, okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Assemblyman.
May I ask a quick question?
Is my sound working now? Yeah, perfect. Sorry. I went to 2 different screens here and it messed with my sound. Members, any additional questions?
I believe Assemblywoman Duran has a question.
If you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and announce your name.
This is Assemblywoman Duran. I do have a question.
I see Assemblywoman Duran speaking. I believe that you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
No, Assemblywoman Duran, I think you're having the same issue I was having. If you want to try the bottom left corner where there is the little microphone.
Here, I think it's your
You
computer.
want to click on that. I think you
I can hear her.
scroll through the different microphone options.
Flores.
If you want to try all 3 of them, see which one
Can you
works
hear
best.
me now? Hello?
Chair, excuse me,
We're
this
still
is
not
Cindy
getting
with
sound.
Broadcasting. Chair Flores, can you hear me?
I hear fine on my side.
I can hear Assemblywoman Duran.
I messaged the chair, so I'm just waiting for a reply back.
You don't want to duplicate that. Is that process, because you said there was one agency that does report that, is that distributed to the chief and to members of the board as well for that report?
Thank you for the question, Dave Fogerson, for the record. And I believe, are you discussing about the State Disaster Identification Coordination Committee with various requirements that we struck there?
Yes.
Copy, thank you. Most of those reports are done at the local level and not at the state level. There is a report that committee does provide to me that is outside the open meeting law to talk about the ability for the state to respond to mass fatality incidences. And I do have to apologize. I just noticed that in that language, that's where I see our confusion, and that's completely my fault for not mentioning it. We did change the State Disaster Identification Coordination Committee to meet once a year instead of every quarter, because that fits more of the requirements of that group as outlined. So I apologize for that discrepancy.
So it'll be changed back to quarterly? Is that what you're saying? I got confused.
No, that committee does want to meet once a year instead of every quarter or as necessary. Such as during COVID, we've had to meet multiple times to take care of issues that we've been concerned about. But in a non-disaster situation, an annual meeting of that group to make sure that all the parties are on the same page is adequate.
So maybe the language should just say during an emergency as needed or required by the committee person, I guess. Not sure.
Yes, we can probably wordsmith that a little better. I can work with our DAG and the LCB and see if we can wordsmith that line a little better so that way it is more clear than that.
Thank you.
And thank you. And members, again, I apologize if some of you have had unmuted yourselves and I could not hear you on my end. So I want to make sure that I give those of you who had unmuted yourselves and were requesting to ask a question to do that now. I don't believe we have anybody. Oh, Assemblywoman Dickman, are you hoping to ask a question?
Yes, please, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one. I just want to clarify, so the State Disaster Committee, Identification Coordinating Committee met and everyone was in agreement that this was okay to change from a quarterly to an annual meeting?
Thank you for the question. David Fulgerson for the record. Yes, we've had multiple conversations with the members of that group and with the division. And in fact, during COVID, we had multiple meetings, and even during multiple meetings, it was kind of a rehash of the information they'd already discussed at the prior meeting. And so that group was good with moving it to a longer term basis, but at the requirements of the chair, so that way we can meet when we need to in an emergency.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And thank you, members. I don't believe we have any other questions. Should you have another question, they will be at the conclusion of going through support, opposition, and neutral, be coming back into the meeting to do any closing remarks. And at that time, you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions. So at this time, I'd like to ask those wishing to speak in support. Broadcast, if we could please go to those wishing to speak in support. And I ask that you limit your remarks to 2 minutes.
To testify in support, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 689. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Tom, T-O-M, Dunn, D-U-N-N, District Vice President for the Professional Firefighters of Nevada. We're here to support AB 14. We believe that this bill will lead to greater efficiency with the DEM and our emergency management partners across the state. Thank you.
And thank you. If we could please go to the next caller wishing to speak in support.
Chair, there are no more callers in support.
At this time, we'll take those wishing to testify in opposition to Assembly Bill 14.
To testify in opposition of Bill number AB 14, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue.
And I will let the record reflect that we did not have anybody sign in opposition, so we were not expecting anybody to do so. However, we wanted to open up the lines just for the sake of clarity and fairness in case somebody didn't have an opportunity to do that. Broadcasting, please, I apologize for interrupting you.
Chair, there are no more callers in opposition of Bill number AB 14.
Thank you, Broadcasting. At this time, I'd like to open up for those wishing to speak in the neutral position.
To testify in neutral for Bill number AB 14, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no more callers in neutral for Bill number AB 14 at this time.
Thank you, Broadcasting. And I will state so that the record reflects that we did have one individual sign in the neutral position from the Nevada Division of Public and Behavioral Health, Public Health Preparedness, Emily Gold. And I just put that on the record so that it is clearly reflected that we did have somebody wishing to speak in the neutral position. From the sign-in sheet, we did not have anybody wishing to speak in the in opposition of the bill. And then we did have 3 individuals sign in support. At this time, any closing remarks you may have?
Thank you, Chair. David Fogerson, Division of Emergency Management, for the record. I appreciate the questions that we had on the bill, and I will work with LCB and our DAG to clean up some of this language to make it that way. Each of these committees have the same language on the quarterly at the call of the chair or annually at the call of the chair. So that way we clarify some of that, make it much more clear moving forward with everyone. And I appreciate the time that you spent listening to our presentation about our division, and thank you for your help.
And thank you again for the presentation. Members, I appreciate your concerns being raised. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic and you want to make sure that we're meeting so that the public has accessible information via minutes as to exactly what's happening. And at the same exact time, we want to make sure that we're allowing everybody to do whatever work they have to do and not necessarily restraining by tying their hands with specific mandates. So I'm sure we'll find a comfortable middle ground to the committee's satisfaction. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the hearing on Assembly Bill 14. And at this time, I'd like to open it up for public comment. Anybody wishing to speak? Broadcasting, please.
Caller with the last 3 digits of 530, please. Oh. Chair, the public line is open and working, and there are no more callers at this time.
All right, members, thank you again. And I apologize for my technical difficulties there in the middle of the hearing. I appreciate everybody indulging me. So with that, members, we are done with today's work. Thank you. We just had our very first hearing, and Luckily, I take the hit on creating the hiccups there and not any of you. I expect for our meetings to continue to flow smoothly, and as people get more comfortable with calling in and participating with these meetings, I anticipate support, neutral, and opposition growing. Every time I'll make it a point to try to specify how many folk signed in support, opposition, or neutral, as many of them don't always wish to speak, but just so that the record reflects how many folk we had on each side, just for the sake of clarity, fairness, and so that everybody is heard one way or the other. With that, members, we're going to be meeting again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're going to continue with presentations for tomorrow and Thursday and Friday. Just to finish off the week strong, we're going to be having 2 bill presentations. I want to make sure you give yourself an opportunity to review those ahead of time. I don't anticipate anything being overly controversial, but we'll have a lot of clarifying questions, and just so that we can kind of understand exactly where they're coming from. Members, thank you again. To our newest member, thank you. Day one, you hit the ground running with the question, so I appreciate you. And we'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. This meeting's adjourned.